Before I start, I just want to say how great it is to be here. This has been said by many other speakers, and I'm just echoing, I think, the feeling that we all have that this is such a wonderful opportunity. My association with Elizabeth Cann goes back to 1987, when I curated an exhibition of her work. Oh my goodness, of her work for the Dalhousie Art Gallery, and this conference has really given me the opportunity, if I could use that language, to recuperate my own art historical project in a way to revisit Elizabeth Cann, to talk to colleagues about her anew, to look at her work through another lens. So it's, again, really a wonderful opportunity for me to be here. So let's see, so advance, I'm a Mac user here, sorry. Okay. This paper looks at the work of Yarmouth, Nova Scotia painter Elizabeth Cann, an artist best known for her portraits of other women and young girls. Born into a wealthy family of Nova Scotia shipbuilders, well-educated and well-traveled, Elizabeth Cann painted women of her own class, as well as the working-class poor and the unemployed. Represented in every instance as lonely or isolated individuals, the women in Cann's paintings lead us to consider the concept of difference in the lived experience of gender and class for the artist and for her audiences. On the screen this morning, we have two photographs of Elizabeth Cann, one taken when she was fairly young, and the other taken much later in life, but the same woman, obviously. In both cases, Cann seems uncomfortable in front of the camera, painfully self-conscious, and acutely aware of the exposure and the scrutiny of the camera's eye. In both, she seems extremely closed off, dramatically so in the picture on the right, in which she seems to literally recoil from our gaze. It's interesting to consider the source and the context of these photographs. The one on the left is from a family album taken at a local commercial photography studio, and a portrait not untypical for its time. The picture on the right is taken from a directory of maritime artists published in 1967. In this book, each artist's entry is one page in length, consisting of a photograph and a summary of artistic achievements. While we don't know if the photograph was taken expressly for this publication, we should assume that the artist herself submitted it, and in so doing, that she effected an act of self-representation, silk scarf, Persian lamb coat, hat, and all. This issue of self-representation is what I want to talk about today in the work of Elizabeth Cann. Interestingly, the reluctant model we see in these photographs was an artist who directed her gaze at other women in her artistic practice as a painter of portraits. Through such acts, through the painting of portraits of other women, I want to suggest, Elizabeth Cann expressed herself and reflected on her own lived life. I would describe what she painted and what she looked at as processes in, reflections on, and expressions of a continuing reinterpretation and remaking of herself and her life. I'm suggesting by this more than what Frances Borzello describes in her book, Seeing Ourselves, Women's Self-Portraits, as, quote, painted versions of autobiography, unquote. I understand Cann's work in terms of what the ethnomethodologist Alec McCool describes as the creation of everyday life, and in so doing, to consider her artistic practice as including but not limited to the artworks she produced. That is to say that we must also consider, among other things, her experience in the studio, including her choice of and engagement with models, the venues where she exhibited, the paintings sold or not sold, and even to the extent to which she did or did not engineer her own artistic legacy. All is the subject of our inquiry into the way she created her own life, the way, to reference McCool again, that she experienced herself as human. By situating my talk within this inquiry into the everyday, I'm approaching Cann's work as both her practice and as the reflection of her subjectivity, as an expression of herself and her life as she lived it and experienced it. We have very little information on Elizabeth Cann and no insight into her personal life. She left no correspondence, and family and friends who remember her describe her as extremely private. She had 9 brothers and sisters, but spent over 20 years from her early teens to her mid-30s away at private school, abroad, or living in Montreal or Toronto. We know she had friends in Yarmouth, that she taught adult education art classes, gave talks on the history of art, and took on private students. Financially, she was set for life and independent in every way. Elizabeth Lovett Cann was born in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, the youngest of 10 children of Hugh Bradford Cann and Augusta Lovett. The Cann and Lovett families were 2 of the oldest and wealthiest in Yarmouth, having produced generations of shipbuilders and ship's captains. In total, the Cann families of Western Nova Scotia were associated with over 300 vessels as captains, mariners, and builders. The town of Yarmouth itself was an extremely prosperous shipbuilding center, at one point in the 19th century boasting more tonnage per capita than any other port in the world. The wealth of the Cann and Lovett families ensured professional and semi-professional occupation for the men, and for the women, private schools followed by a university education. Elizabeth Cann's mother attended Mount Allison University, as did several of her other female relatives. Besides wealth, there was also political power. Elizabeth Cann's maternal grandfather was John Walker Lovett, a Liberal MLA for Yarmouth County, a member of Parliament, and senator for Yarmouth from 1896 to 1908 under Wilfrid Laurier. The family was Anglican, attending Holy Trinity Church in Yarmouth. At the age of 13, after the death of her father, Cann left Yarmouth for Montreal to attend private school, spending 2 years at the Trafalgar Institute for Girls, followed by 4 years at St. Helens School in Dunham, Quebec. Next was a long and extensive training period as an artist. For a year at the Philadelphia Academy of Fine Arts with Daniel Garber, and this is Garber's South Room, Green Street from 1920, and a year at the New York School of Applied Design for Women. Then, accompanied by her mother, she traveled to Europe, took the Grand Tour, and studied at several of the Paris academies, followed by a residency at the Harvard Proctor Academy in Cornwall, England. This is Harold Harvey's The Critics from 1922. Returning from Europe, Cann lived in Montreal and Toronto for several years, a period interspersed with more trips abroad. While in Montreal, Cann set up an artistic practice. She had a solo exhibition at Johnson Galleries in 1927, described in the Montreal Gazette as containing scenes of France, Spain, Switzerland, and England. And beginning in 1929, she submitted work to juried exhibitions with the Royal Canadian Academy, the Art Association of Montreal, the Ontario Society of Artists, the Canadian Society of Graphic Art, and the CNE. Cann's major preoccupation was painting other women. This focus on the female figure suggests several things: a greater interest in women as models, perhaps greater ease with women as opposed to male models in the studio, a stronger interest in depicting the female form and all of its decorative accoutrements, a deeper interest in the lives of women, and through them, a means of establishing agency for herself in the expression of her own subjectivity. In this painting entitled At the Theater, painted around 1929, Cann presents us with the portrait of a striking young woman who stares off into space, seemingly disassociated or disconnected from the world around her. As is the case in all of Cann's paintings, the decorative elements are important, providing drama as well as visual interest. Here, the figure displays the flowers on her purse like a sign. More flowers are visible arranged at her hip. The fur coat slung over the chair with its rich folds, and the pink underpainting representing the slip beneath the black gauze of the gown function as signifiers of wealth and refinement, as does the highly aestheticized experience of the painting itself. as a setup or staged work, that is, not a portrait of a woman painted at the theater, but the state of being defined by experiences such as this, Cann constructs a life of a woman who is profoundly alone. An interesting precursor to this painting is this work by Prudence Heward, also titled At the Theater, painted a year earlier and shown at the Royal Canadian Academy exhibition in 1929. Cann would almost certainly have seen this Heward work. She herself had a drawing entitled A Cottage in the Bourbonnais in that exhibition. And my colleague Diane O'Neill this morning has pointed out Cann's association with the Beaver Hall Group, an obviously important networking connection for Cann in Montreal. It's also a nice coincidence that Prudence Heward's At the Theater is the image on the splash page for this year's conference. Whether or not Heward's work was a formal or thematic model for Cann's At the Theater of the following year, this would be the last time that she would show an interest in exhibiting her European scenes, and it would mark the beginning of her commitment to portraiture. The following year, in fact, she submitted this painting, entitled Portrait of a Model, to the RCA. Here, a portrait, as the title insists, Cann has positioned her model to pose as a model out of her pose, so to speak, represented as having stepped down from her chair as if to take a break. Staged in this way, and not unlike At the Theater, the painting operates as a narrative of a life lived and an inquiry into a state of mind. Signaling to the viewer that she is painting an individual, Cann creates a psychological portrait of a woman whose work it is to pose for artists. And while the model does not return the gaze, Cann has endowed her with subjectivity. Again, we see Cann's use of the decorative and the figure's seeming obliviousness to it as animating forces in the painting. The themes of detachment and isolation are worked out here through the structuring of a very shallow pictorial space and the confinement of the figure by folds of drapery and the fan-like chair back. When Elizabeth Cann returned to Yarmouth in 1936, the town was greatly changed. As her nephew George Cann noted, quote, "The Great Depression wiped out class distinction in southern Nova Scotia. When I went to school, we were all children of working class parents," unquote. Still, Elizabeth Cann resided in one of Yarmouth's great old homes, and after the death of her mother in 1942, she lived there entirely alone. Apart from one or two trips to England, she remained in Yarmouth until her death at the age of 66. She never married. Notwithstanding her return to an extremely isolated part of the Canadian art world, even by regional standards, Cann maintained her connection with the larger art world, continuing to send work to the RCA until 1945, and to other national venues throughout the 30s and 40s. She also participated in the regional art scene, contributing annually to Maritime Art Association exhibitions, the Nova Scotia Society of Artists exhibitions, and the Nova Scotia Department of Adult Education exhibitions, shown in Halifax and in regional tours. She held 2 solo exhibitions in Yarmouth during her lifetime, one in 1927 and one in 1947. Notices in the local paper took the usual local celebrity approach. Whatever her thoughts and ambitions were on the place of her artwork in the national landscape, her art world connections and friendships were provincial at best. She worked in her studio at the back of her house, producing portraits and still lifes, and in the short springs and summers, painted on plein air, producing landscapes in oil and watercolor. Her approach to the female subject did not change, and the presentation of profound solitariness persists. Through the titling of this work, Restlessness, exhibited at the RCA in 1945, Cann defines her subject as a particular state of mind or condition. Here, the symbols of restlessness, of boredom and entrapment are pervasive. The magazine thrown over the arm of the chair, the awkward twist of the body as if leaning towards escape, and the confining bulky robe tightly buttoned at the throat. And what are we to make of the two pair of shoes? Those worn, black, hard, even menacing, and those unworn, pink with fluffy bows. Again, we have a figure confined, here by a chair which entirely contains her form, and by the vertical bars of the screen or exotic wallpaper behind her. Like a bird in a gilded cage, she is surrounded by artificial nature, flattened out images of flowers and of birds which fly about in all directions. Here too we have a staged picture entitled A Soldier's Wife, which later came to be known as War Bride, painted around 1941. The model is the artist's sister-in-law, married to Elizabeth Cann's oldest brother, Donald, who went overseas in 1939. Symbols of the passing of time, the weariness of domestic routine, and of a life of boredom are dramatized by the inclusion of the calendar in the left with its cheerful ship, the mixing bowl and spoon in a state of suspended animation, and the heavy drooping brooch. This work, like the others, echoes Cann's larger inquiry into the lives of women and of intellectual, physical, and spiritual strength which is unfulfilled or exhausted. Notable, of course, is the fact that the sitters never return the gaze, which we interpret as indications of dislocation and distraction. But we may even want to consider the possibility that this represents another form of distancing, by imagining the dynamic in Cann's studio and her own uneasiness or discomfort at receiving the model's direct stare. For the rest of her artistic career, Cann focused attention on the women around her. Although many of her works are lost to us, those with titles such as Shelling Peas and One of the Unemployed, listed in the 1939 Nova Scotia Society of Artists exhibition catalog, and Rummage Sale in Mission School, listed in the 1947 Art Association of Montreal catalog, suggests that she took an interest in the lives of working classes, the routine of daily chores, and the unemployed. When asked if she was class conscious, her nephew George Cann told me, quote, "My sense is that Aunt Beth didn't fit in with the cultural elite, despite her speech, which was more formal and European than that of a Nova Scotia native. She was at ease with fellow artists and students of art. She was in no way ostentatious. She would strike off across the roughed fields to capture the image and background she was after. She remained an observer of all classes, and I think showed no partiality regardless of the background of her subjects," unquote. This painting, entitled Mother and Child, of a weary working-class mother and her baby, is a narrative about rupture, supported in formal terms by the proliferation of notches or V-shapes in the work, the large opening of white created by the space between child and the mother who is sunken away from the infant, the V of the collar and notched sleeve of her dress, the notch in the chair back, and the V formed by the neckline of the baby's sweater. In this double portrait, Cann clearly subverts the natural state of motherhood, of what at that time would have been considered the normal mother-child bond. There is also the subverting of the viewer's expectation of such a relationship. The title of this painting, At the End of the Day, painted around 1939, suggests that the figure is a working woman, positioned with her purse in her lap and her coat not hung up but slung over her chair. This painting was submitted to the RCA exhibition in 1939. Sometimes the models in Cann's paintings are identified, as is the case here in Portrait of Joan Burrage. Positioned in front of a brick wall, the figure occupies an extremely shallow space. Decorative elements so familiar in Cann's work prevail, with the skewed collar, the peach sweater, hairband, and jacket. Elizabeth Cann also painted numerous portraits of young girls, several of whom lived down the road from her and who needed the money she paid for modeling. Even Cann's children are pensive or sad, and like their older counterparts, seem trapped or weighed down. This is titled A Country Girl, one of several portraits Cann made of two sisters, Violet and Artie Power, a work she exhibited at the RCA in 1942. Here in youth, we see the same sobriety as in Cann's portraits of women. The severity of the child's face is balanced by the fluidity of line, pattern, and texture discovered in the skirt and the transparent white blouse. The adult demeanor of the sitter is belied by the suggestion of childlike carelessness in the rumpled skirt and twisted straps and bow at the neck. When I visited the Yarmouth County Museum about a month ago during my research for this paper, I found on Elizabeth Cann 2 slim file folders containing some photocopies, a few newspaper items, and 1 letter from Elizabeth Cann written to a friend who had submitted it to the archives after Elizabeth Cann's death. The several paintings and watercolors in the collection had come from various donors, also given after Elizabeth Cann's death. That Elizabeth Cann herself did not see fit to deposit, if she even saved, any material related to her life as an artist suggests that she did not consider her correspondence, her exhibition catalogs, mementos, or other effects to be of interest or value, or that she deemed these to be entirely related to the private sphere, or that it never crossed her mind to do so. And there was a wonderful paper given this morning by Amy Furness called Seeking the Individual Traces of Historical Women Artists, and it struck me so forcibly that this is obviously the case with Elizabeth Cann. According to her nephew, Elizabeth Cann also resisted the urging of her siblings to sell any of her paintings during her lifetime. In her will, she left all of her work to her niece Beth, who I met in the late 1980s when I was researching the Dalhousie Art Gallery exhibition. Beth Cann had her Aunt Elizabeth's work stowed safely in the attic, where I was not allowed to go. And as she brought the paintings down to me to see, and in response to my expression of interest in acquiring several for the Dalhousie Art Gallery, she expressed real concern that this would in some way violate her aunt's privacy and her memory. I'd like to end today with a final photograph of Elizabeth Cann, here in the local newspaper, second from the left, at a Yarmouth Christmas tea and sale, taken in the late 1960s and 70s. Here she is, like one of her models, detached from her surroundings, somewhat stricken at the exposure, or seemingly surprised at finding herself the subject of another's gaze. Surrounded by friends, she looks as uncomfortable as we have seen her before. And I think she's wearing the same hat. Thank you.